suburban eastern Australia, an environment that has, over time, evolved some extraordinarily unique groups of Homo sapiens. But today, we observe a small tribe akin to a group of meerkats that gather together atop a small mound to watch, question, and discuss the current events of their city, their country, and their world at large. Let's listen keenly and observe this group fondly known as the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Hello and welcome back, dear listener. This is episode 431 of the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove podcast. Last week I said we'd be back with the normal panel discussion, and that's not the case. It's another special episode. It's myself, Trevor, the Iron Fist, and a special guest I'd like you to meet, dear listener, is Cameron Leckie. Welcome aboard the podcast, Cameron.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks for having me.
Yes, dear listener. So Cameron is a husband, a father, stepfather, and a retired Army officer and veteran, and he's been quite prolific in writing articles in the John Menadue blog and posting tweets, and I happen to agree with virtually everything he writes. And it's all along the lines of we're making big mistakes with our defence decisions and our foreign policy, and he too has issues with the US empire. So I thought we'd get Cameron on, and he and I could agree with each other for a good hour as we moan about the state of the world and wished everybody agreed with us. But if you're in the chat room, say hello, ask some questions if you've got any. We'll try to incorporate them if we can. So Cameron, why don't you just kick off with sort of who you are and what your experience was in the military, and that might add some sort of context to how you think about the world.
Sure, no worries. Thanks, Trevor. Before I get going, I don't normally look like this. It's just I had a skin cancer cut out on Friday, so it'll be off in a week or so. But I'll get into it. So I joined the Army straight out of high school. So did year 12, and 6 weeks later, or 8 weeks later, I was in the Army. Went to the Defence Force Academy in Canberra, 3 years there, and then a year at Duntroon doing officer training. Graduated as a lieutenant, and there you are on your way into your military career. And I guess when I joined, I'd always wanted to join the Army. It's the only thing I'd really ever wanted to do.
Did you have military in the family? Did your dad?
My father was conscripted during the Vietnam era. He didn't go to Vietnam, but he was served, I think, well over 30 years in the Army Citizens Military Force and then the Army Reserve. And he's still involved in military history in his battalion down in Ballarat. My grandfather, I was in World War II. He was actually in Ambon and was on one of the last planes flew out of Ambon before the Japanese captured it. And if you know your military history, you know that about half of those soldiers who were captured lost their lives in captivity. So I guess a bit lucky to actually get back to Darwin, unlike a lot of the people.
Was that Singapore or?
No, Ambon's an island in now Indonesia.
Right.
So we had a number of battalions on small islands like Timor, Ambon. There's one other I can't remember, but they, small force, and the Japanese overwhelmed them all. They never had a chance. But that's the decisions that were made at the time, and end up a lot of people dying.
Just as a matter of interest, my father lied about his age so he could get into the Second World War, and was shipped off. Arrived in Singapore just in time for the surrender. Found himself in Changi prison and went on the Burma Railway. Did the whole thing. So one of the very lucky few to survive that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it, to think an underage person would get themselves into that situation, but glad he survived.
Yes.
Unlike so many others. Yeah, so I guess, it's funny how your perception of things changes when you're young. Like, all I wanted to do when I was young is go to war. Like, I thought, prove yourself and all that sort of stuff. And now I can't think of anything worse. And not that I've been on operations. I went over to East Timor in 1999. I went to the Solomon Islands for a while in 2003, and also went to Sumatra in Indonesia after the tsunami. So it's had a couple of trips up to Banda Aceh and that. And, I guess as you grow up and you mature and you see a few things, you start to realise that war's not a great thing. It's not a game. and the reasons we go to war are also increasingly questionable. And I guess as I grew up, it took me a while, a bit of a slow learner maybe, but first half of my military career, I was thinking, we're the good guys. Doing this for the right reasons. And then the second half of my career started to question things until by the time I got out, I was thinking we're heading in totally the wrong direction.
Were there any particular moments that caused you to switch across?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's a pretty big process, I guess. Like, I could have gone to Iraq. I got posted out of my job early because of personal circumstances. And if I had stayed where I was, I would have been in Iraq back in 2004, and I wouldn't have given it a second thought. I would have been actually quite excited about it, as I think most soldiers, when they get the opportunity in the Australian Army to deploy, they're generally, at least on their first trip, pretty excited about it. You train, spend all that time to do the business, and I guess you think chance to do the business, as well as I guess at those early days, you sort of think you're doing it for a good reason. So I think probably as things unfold in Iraq, and that probably, questions started to be able to raise, where are the weapons of mass destruction, and what's their long-term plan? What are we doing there? And you see the brutality of what's occurring in places like Fallujah and stuff like that. I was posted at Canungra at the officer training wing there for 4 years, and we had people come and give talks about their experiences, and some of them had been in Iraq, and I remember one guy in particular he was just a mess. He'd been posted with the Marine Corps in Iraq, and some of the stories he told, like, it was just horrendous what he'd been through. So I guess all these things just start opening up your eyes a little bit. And
they were happy for him to talk in that way to people. They didn't want to censor that sort of viewpoint.
Well, I don't think he was necessarily. It wasn't political by any means. It was just him retelling his story. But it's like pretty. You could tell he was a mess on the inside, and there's several people like that who you can just see their mental health and PTSD and similar issues. It just mounts and builds over time, and you start to get this picture of what's going on, and then you start reading more widely as well about events going on in the world, like what happened in Libya and NATO's involvement. Like, I guess it's a little sort of a warning bell. Then what happened in Ukraine in 2014, that's probably a pretty significant moment. I mean, it just seems so full on, and particularly, MH17 being shot down, the media coverage and the anti-Russia slant on the whole events just seems so full on. And I thought, when it's so over the top, the coverage, you start thinking, well, if it's why is it like that? And I guess you start reading and listening and searching for information a bit wider.
And then, what year did you leave? Did the defence?
Not till 2019, I think, was my last year.
Right.
2018 is my last year of work, and I was on leave until I discharged in 2019. So it's that gradual process. But by those last few years, I was thinking, we're well and truly. We're not doing what we're saying we're doing. We're not doing it, for democracy and freedom and all those sort of catch cries which get rolled out every time we deploy troops overseas. I'd pretty well come to the conclusion that the only reason we did what we were doing was to support the alliance with the United States, which in effect was really just supporting an empire which is as brutal as any empire that's ever existed, I'd argue.
And could you feel that you could talk to any of your fellow officers, frankly, about these things, or did you have to keep it all close to your chest?
No, in one-on-one or small group discussions or whatever, I think a lot of people sort of would agree or to an extent. But I guess a lot of people in the military aren't particularly political, just want to go about doing their job. And, I guess just accept the world is for what it is. And I guess I got to the point, though, where I was thinking, like, if I was told I had to deploy somewhere, I was at the point where I was thinking, well, I don't necessarily know if I could. And once you get to that point, you're probably time to leave the military because, when you sign up, that's when you commit to supporting whatever the government tells you to support. And once you start thinking, well, I can't do that anymore, it was time to leave.
Any inkling as to whether in the very upper echelons of the Defence Force that any of the, I don't know, admirals or whatever they're called up there, generals, whether they, any inkling from you as to whether any of them understand any of this, or whether they've succumbed to the propaganda and they're all the way with LBJ?
Yeah, I think to get to that level, you need to be committed to the cause, so to speak. I think there's probably few people in the military who have sort of gone the direction I have, who in seeing the alliance and that as being the opposite of our national interest. Certainly you'd get cut down pretty quickly at that level. Your prospects for future promotion and that would be gone. So I think it's not necessarily censorship per se, but it's more self-censorship that there's no point in raising uncomfortable issues or asking awkward questions if you want to continue up up to the glamoring heights of a general. So I think it sort of almost self-selects for people who are are believers in the cause. I guess just one little anecdote, not related to the alliance per se, but one of my last jobs, I was doing training development on a new piece of equipment that Defence was developing, and I'd been working on it for 6 months or 12 months, or best part of a year, I guess, and I knew it was a pretty ordinary bit of kit, a lemon, and I'd done all the training development, developed the training package, helped deliver the first training for this piece of equipment, and the soldiers could tell straight up it was a piece of, it's just called a lemon.
Yep.
And we provide feedback, etc. And then the next year I started my new job, and the general who was in charge of that piece of kit came to our unit. We had a bit of a dog and pony show, as we call them. So all the troops were out, had all our equipment set up, and he'd come around and they'd brief on whatever. And he's talking about this brand new bit of kit, how it's going to solve all these problems, how great it was going to be. And this is a bit of kit I'd been working on. I knew it was a lemon, and I sort of just clicked on my brain and think, well, there's these two things that happened here. Is he's telling porcupines and that, or everyone up to his level or below his level when getting briefed on it, it said, yeah, it's all good, it's all good, it's all good, it's all good. So by the time it gets to the top, it's we've met all the requirements. It's a good piece of kit, and the troops will get it and be able to do their job. But it just sort of shows how Defence doesn't encourage people to think too far left or right of what's expected, or to, bad news doesn't go very well up the chain. So sort of people sort of...
I mean, all large organisations have an element of groupthink that goes on,
yes,
where it's difficult for people to pop their head above the parapet and disagree. But the military just takes that to another level, doesn't it, where you obeying orders and discipline is just accentuates that groupthink problem.
Yeah, I think it's a known problem, and like we have a planning process in the Army called the Military Appreciation Process, which is a deliberate planning process, which I've used throughout my career, trained people on it, etc. And it's a known problem, and the idea is that you get people to sort of question it or take the other side or all that, but I guess just day to day and cultural wise, when you're talking about things which are fairly outside of the bounds, I guess, of normal behaviour, questioning the fundamental of our defence policy, which is the alliance with the United States, that's sort of, it's quite, it's sort of outside of that realm, I guess, where the people are willing to question. And you think, I guess it's just right how intertwined the Australian Defence Force and the United States are, like, very inextricably linked. And I mean, I was posted to an artillery regiment in Townsville for a couple of years, and we went to Shoalwater Bay for one exercise. And we had to, do a form to request our Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, to get a couple of F-18s to come and do a strike mission like 48 hours in advance, for all their planning cycles. And then we had the Americans with an aircraft carrier sitting off the coast, and they had a guy there. It was just like, oh, we've got another 2 planes, and we could not keep up with actually allocating the planes to the forward observers who were coordinating all the fire. So it gives the sheer power that the United States has, had and still has to a large extent. And you look at our military capability, you can see why people also get, sucked into it. Like, how you see all this military power and capacity to do things, and we haven't got anywhere near that. So I guess, you can see how people get wrapped up, think, well, having the Americans on side is a good thing.
Yes. So, having a sort of a devil's advocate would be great in a meeting to say, on the flip side, if we look at it this way, maybe it's not such a good idea. Clearly there was no devil's advocate in the room when AUKUS was being discussed, or when Morrison came up with that idea. So, what are your thoughts on AUKUS and a sort of, it's a closer alliance, I guess, with the US and the UK in terms of, the main feature of it is the supply of submarines. And Cameron, we've been doing this podcast for 9 years or something, and almost from the first episode, I've been talking about submarines, and because it's just been one crazy decision after another. Initially, we had Abbott looking at the Japanese subs off the shelf, which seemed at the time and with hindsight probably not a bad option if you're going to be getting submarines, certainly better than a lot of the others. And then we had this absurd decision to get the French to take their nuclear submarines and strip out the nuclear-powered component and make them diesel-powered. And virtually every expert on submarine technology was saying it was fraught with danger. It was the most difficult thing you could possibly contemplate to change the sort of drive system of a submarine. And then that all got blown out of the water, and Morrison gave Macron eventually the bad news, and we slipped over to the American version. And in short, dear listener, my view of the submarines is if they're defensive, which we would hope that's what they are, to defend Australian territory, you want them small and as silent as possible, lurking off the Australian coast and ready to attack something that's attacking us, as opposed to these larger submarines which seem to be designed to sail all the way over to China and start attacking China. It seems to be how they, what their purpose is. So, what's your view on the whole submarine debacle over the time?
This is a debacle. I don't think it's really actually about the submarines at its core. I guess we can get to that in due course, but my take on where history runs in cycles, and empires run in cycles, and I think the US empire obviously took over the British after World War II. Had a competitor in the Soviet Union that ended in sort of 1990-91, and then we had the unipolar moment. And to be honest, the United States botched it completely. They could have maintained their number one position in the world for a very long time if they had learned, just been a little bit clever about their relationships with other countries and not needing to dominate them. So as a result, the Iraq, Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine, etc. These are all markers of imperial decline, and I think we're well past the peak. It's now on the downhill trajectory. Mm-hmm. And there's desperation. There's desperation in the US. The US ambassador to China said the other day, summed it up, we can't afford to be second, or we won't be second. And that's what a lot of this is about, is desperation. You don't say that if you're on top, you don't need to. But they're trying to from a US perspective, want to reclaim their number one spot, which I think is impossible. And then you have the British in on this, who are once grand imperial power, who can't quite get over the fact they're no longer the empire, so they're on the coattails of the United States. And then you have good old Australia, who obviously formed from since whitefellas came with the British settlement. We've always had an imperial overlord, whether that's the Britain to start off with, or since World War II, the US. So nobody alive in Australia knows of an Australia that's actually not had that imperial master to look after us as if we need looking after. So I think there's desperation, and I really think that's a key driver in why we have AUKUS. It's that so empires collapse from the periphery to the core. And so, like you see Turkey, you might have seen they're looking at joining BRICS. So, Turkey's part of NATO, etc., whatever. Well, they're now starting to move in another orbit. So, as things unfold and the US's imperial system starts to crack, that starts on the peripheries, and I guess Australia's a part of the core of that empire. And we're desperate, not for any good reason other than we think that our security and not our prosperity, but our security is wrapped up with the United States. And I really think AUKUS is a symptom of that desperation. And so I guess from the US perspective, there's so much stuff that keeps dribbling out about all the capacity issues with building submarines and being able to maintain their own fleet, etc. I think that's the little candy being dropped in front of Australia to say, get involved, and our politicians have taken that to grabbed it. But I really think the most important part of AUKUS from the US perspective is the access and the basing rights that the US military has in Australia, which scares the life out of me, because if and I'm more leaning to a position of when war breaks out with China, and it, in my view, will be triggered not by China but by the United States, that means we'll be used as a launching pad for that war. And I don't think we can win it. And even if we did win the war, I don't think there'd be any benefit to Australia, given China's relationship from a trading perspective with us. And it also makes us a target. So it's like a lose-lose situation we've got ourselves into. And then you can add another lose there about all the money we're spending on submarines, which may not and probably won't, I don't think they will, to be honest, be delivered. So we're handing over billions of dollars for something that will probably never eventuate, but could actually, bring Australia to its knees. And I can't think of anything more serious miscalculation than that.
So the nuclear subs were just a little shiny trinket to wave in front of Morrison to sort of just as a cheap way to get us locked in even more with the US. And there's such a long-term investment, I struggle to use the word, but commitment, such a long-term commitment that once you commit to this, you're really locked in for decades with this sort of stuff. So I can see from the US point of view that it was good for them. I can see from the UK point of view that they got to sell some technology, and either Rolls-Royce or Boeing or somebody over there managed to get some money to sort of be part of this. I can see how Morrison was so stupid and such a lapdog to US interests that he would fall for anything. The part that is particularly disappointing is that Anthony Albanese, while in opposition with a couple of his senior leaders, was told about the AUKUS proposal by Morrison in confidence, and within 24 hours, Albanese said, yes, we agree to this, we give bipartisan support. On something as significant as that, and he was proud of the fact that he could make that decision in under 24 hours. That's the part that's just so disappointing that could happen like that.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, and I don't think it's the original decision, obviously as an outsider, I don't think there's anything else other than not presenting itself as a target from which it could be wedged by the Liberals. I think that's what it's all about. And of course, now that they're committed, it'll require change in leadership to send it on another direction. They've committed to it, and of course, politically untenable to now say, "Oh no, it was a bad deal," or whatever. So I think this will run to failure. The submarines will run to failure in the next election cycle or two, maybe three, as we have new leadership or new parties taking over the reins of power. And I mean, because you just see there's this constant trickle of information which just highlighting what a flawed proposal it is. And sooner or later those, and the costs, of course, those things will come to the fore. And when the people who've made the decision are far enough in history, as far as leadership goes, things will change. But we'll have wasted an awful lot of money. And you're right, as you mentioned, the other submarines, and I met several commentators such as Hugh White have mentioned, we could have a fleet of 20 or 40 submarines for a fraction of the cost of what these are going to cost us and actually be more useful to Australia's needs. But I guess the political environment is such that, we need a change of leadership for a change of direction before it runs to failure, which that's where I think it will end up.
Well, I think of it, just manning submarines. It seems like it's difficult to find people to be willing to be submariners. Funnily enough, people don't want to be locked up in a little tin can for a months on end underwater with a bunch of smelly submariners for company. What's your perspective on recruiting people for jobs like this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a long issue. I mean, part of that, there's an article in the Conversation today about recruiting, and I think research being commissioned by Defence, but they missed the important point as far as I'm concerned, is that's the link between what our national strategy is, defence strategy, and our alliance with the United States, and what that is doing to people's willingness to join the military, because I think there's a link there. But getting back to that, I haven't been on a submarine, but I've been on one of our amphibious ships, and when they lock you down, and if something hits that ship, you're in an awful lot of trouble. So I can understand, hats off to people who are willing to do that sort of work. But obviously, there's only a small number of people who are, in the best of times. Given, all the rhetoric, which I guess to some extent, well, at least parts of the government, I think there's some conflict between defence and foreign affairs on the whole China thing. But I guess the gist of the rhetoric in this country is very anti-China. We never hear a good news story. It's always a negative story about China, often exaggerated, etc. So we have all these beating the war drum, so to speak, like the Red Scare thing that was on last year. And talk about these submarines, which you don't have to be a genius to think, well, they're only going to be used off the coast of China. And I've got to say that might be quite discouraging for a lot of people, thinking you're going to send it to China and we're going to, fire a few missiles there and then hope to get back to Australia. I don't think that's going to happen. So it's not surprising at all that they're having issues with recruitment, and I can't see that changing anyway.
Just circling back to that decision by Morrison and his handful of confidants to agree to AUKUS within 24 hours, there's obviously no thought amongst that group where they have an understanding that the world has changed from a unipolar American hegemon to a multipolar world. Even if they had a proper understanding of that, even with the fear of being wedged by Murdoch papers over not supporting a defence initiative, they just couldn't have countenanced it. But I just don't think there is an understanding in that group at all that the world has changed, that America is on the slide, that there's now BRICS led by China, and all the ducks are in a row for those countries to charge on further and be successful. It's too late. America can't stop them. And so so that there's no understanding, I mean, in that group that the hegemon days are over. And then there's obviously an acceptance by this group of the bogeyman China story, and accepting that America, that the Chinese are these bad guys who are just itching to invade us, given half an opportunity. They seem to have swallowed that line as well.
Yeah. Once again, I guess this is where we agree with each other all night.
Yeah.
But I think we're stuck in an ideology, as in the decision makers, are in an ideology. As I spoke about the military, how you don't get too far up the greasy pole without having a certain worldview. Well, I don't think it's any different in politics, and also the media doesn't help at all. So I mean, there's that intermingling of politics, power, and then foreign interference or influence from our our allies. And I guess I went to I can't remember what it's called, but in Tenterfield there's a Museum of Australian Democracy or something like that. And you can see it's got the posters of the Yellow Peril back from early in the 20th century and that. So I guess there's that underlying fear of the Asiatics that still exists in this country. So I guess when you tick on that underlying concern, that comes out, and I think that's part of it as well. So it doesn't take a lot when you have constant repetition. You look at Russia, look at Iran, look at China. How often in our media do you see anything positive reported on those countries? Never. Okay. Obviously, they're not always doing good things and not always doing bad things, but there's no balance. Whereas the US or the UK, they can do horrendous things and they get a free pass in the media. So that's how propaganda works. That's the most effective form of propaganda, is just to repeat that same mantra, and that shapes people's perceptions. And like the Lowy Institute's does their annual poll that's just come out recently, and once again sort of shows a rising distrust of the US, but also that fear of China. To me, all that shows is that when you have an effective information operation aimed at demonising a country which the political and the media are behind, you can influence people's perceptions, and I think that's been very successful in that path. And so now we've created this. It's become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which would almost be a joke when you think how if we're going to make China an enemy or a potential adversary, you might want to have the military force to back it up. There. So we're creating this boogeyman who we could get in a war with, and which we're in no position to fight a war with in any way, shape or form. It's like quite crazy.
Yeah. There was some article, I think it was John Mennetew blog or somewhere, it was talking about in the Senate estimates, they've talked about just what our naval capacity is, and the total likely combat capability available over the next few years is 2 Collins submarines, 2 air warfare destroyers, and 4 Anzac frigates. That's all we've got in the Navy that was rustled together.
The former Senator Rex Patrick put that together. I think it was on Michael West media.
Right.
That's right. And I mean, those ships would not survive. The ships above the sea surface, on the sea surface, they would not survive very long at all in the South China Sea or anywhere in that area. The subs, their survivability would be greater. But so, which effectively means we have no combat power to actually take a war to China. So it's farcical to think that we would be involved in something like that, given our lack of capability. And I mean, was it Keating? I think said throwing matchsticks or whatever at the toothpicks at the mountain or something. It's like,
yes,
you got to laugh because it's almost ludicrous. But yet we've got ourselves so wound up, as in our, the elites in our sort of security class, so wound up about the China threat, which I like to look at empirical evidence. And China hasn't been in a conflict since 1979. That's 2 years after I was born. You look at the list where the US has been involved, and you need several sheets of paper to write all the interventions out. So I don't see the Chinese all of a sudden, after lifting all these people out of poverty, all of a sudden going to say, all right, now we've got ourselves to the world's biggest economy, and we're going to start invading countries. When you've got to that point by not invading countries, it doesn't make any sense to me.
But particularly if you want something, it's just cheaper and easier to buy it. If China wants our iron ore, it's just way easier to just hand over a check and buy the iron ore rather than the angst of trying to take it by force. So
yes, and I mean these are the sort of I guess we don't want to make things too simple, but I mean you're 100% right. Like, China wants our products, raw materials, so they can send them back to us. So they can end up in Bunnings or Kmart or something. It's like, what benefit is there in having a conflict with a country like Australia, which is providing in what they need so that they can sell it back to us? Like, and if I was the Chinese, military planner, and I wanted to harm Australia, the last thing I would do is invade. Like, there's so many other ways that China could damage us. Most of our fuel, our liquid fuel, crosses us, the South China Sea, that part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
They could stop it at source, and our country, our economy would slowly grind to a halt within, a matter of a week or two. And that would be far more cost effective than actually fighting a war. So it's like, not only are we, ramping ourselves up for something we can't win, but we're also, fighting, building capabilities that are not actually going to be useful in how the enemy, if we think China's going to be the enemy, which I don't, how they might fight at that war. So,
so Cameron,
really,
you and I can see this as clear as day, these mistakes that we're making that are just so obvious, hitching our wagon to the US empire, which is committing all sorts of problems around the world. It's a declining empire. It's the wrong side to be on if you're looking to the future. The facts are just there everywhere. But our political leaders, our defence leaders aren't about to change, it seems, the trajectory. There just doesn't seem to be any inclination at all. Maybe the Greens, but how do we change this? Because I guess it's a combination of propaganda from mainstream media, and with luck, mainstream media, its power declines over time as newspaper sales decline and young people just don't watch television or the nightly news or things like that. So there's sort of a natural depreciation of the power of the mainstream media. But gee, there's some entrenched power benefits there. Like, we've got politicians who are basically Minister for Defence one week, they lose an election, they take 12 months off, and then they appear on the board of Raytheon or some other US arms manufacturer, or they're in some deal. It's in the interests of these people to buddy up with defence contractors and others and American military people. It's hard to keep those tentacles out of our political system. So even if the people who are in power have not been indoctrinated by the propaganda, there's these other, career prospects and trinkets and boards and lobbying and other things that get offered in front of them that compromise their integrity and head us in this same direction. Let's deal with the propaganda of the general public first off. I love what you're doing with articles in the John Minity blog and the things that you're doing on Twitter. What other sources do you see as independent media that you could mention, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty clear that the readership of, I guess, I call it legacy media is declining, and I can only see that increasing because it's becoming more and more obvious to more and more people that a lot of what they're spruiking is propaganda, and I guess we come to the point where they're talking, no one's listening. And I think once we reach that point, and I don't think that's necessarily far off, we'll see some changes. I think it's important to do, what you're doing, what I'm trying to do, is to write, think, talk about it, engage people in the. I think there's a lot of people who think along a similar lines, give or take. They might not necessarily agree with everything, but they can see we're going in the right direction. So there's a constituency there who want change and see the need to change, but we're not politically organised, I guess, at the moment. But I think that's coming. I guess it's, you still need the mechanisms and whatever, but I guess that's what I'm trying to do through writing and tweeting and speaking to people like you, Trevor, is to try and get people thinking. I guess a lot of people can sort of see little bits and pieces, and that's what I'm trying to do, is just draw a lot of these bits and pieces together, put it together in a package so that it's people can get it. And once people get it, I think it's because it's a lot easier to convince someone of something when it's close to the truth. But when like many of the narratives, and I think most of our media is now narrative managers. When they're trying to manage a narrative, and that narrative is getting further and further away from reality, they're at a point where their ability to maintain that narrative is sort of reaching an endpoint. So I think we're well and truly there, and Ukraine has certainly accelerated that process, as is what's happened in Gaza. So I guess that's an element of it.
Are you one of these people at a barbecue? Do you talk about these things in social circles?
A little, not a lot. I do most of my, I write for John Menadue, and I've been published a few other places, and I tweet, but I sort of keep it there because.
Does your wife kick you under the table if you're, at a dinner party and you start talking about the evil American empire? Does she just tell you to shut up? Because people want to talk about the Broncos?
There's limits about how much of this stuff, and I need a break too every now and then because, it can get a bit full on. But I guess I pick and choose. I guess you sort of sound people out, and sometimes it's worth following up, other times not. Because I think you have to be at a certain spot. And I know my own experience, how long it took me to go from being, all the way at the USA, thinking we're the good guys doing good things, through to almost the opposite end of that spectrum. It took me years. So you can't take someone who is a true believer now, or just accepts what they see from our politicians and media, and take them to the point, where I'm at. So, you have to, I guess, judge that. But I mean, events are, what's happening in Gaza, I think, is just any moral legitimacy that Western governments did have, which I think was pretty slim. I think it's been blown out of the water with what's happening in Gaza and our government's reaction to it. So, and once organisations, governments that start losing all their moral power or legitimacy, you're getting to the point where change can occur. So I guess from that perspective, I'm a little bit hopeful that the next election of that, I think we might, hopefully be surge in independence, other parties other than the coalition and Labor.
What do you read or listen to that you find particularly valuable information?
So I read like our legacy media. So primarily ABC, because it's our ABC and the taxpayer funds it. So I feel I have a right to criticise it when it does a poor job. And things such as the Lowy Institute and Australian Strategic Policy Institute, even though that makes my blood boil more often than not.
So you subscribe to their newsletters and stuff, do you?
I don't subscribe, but I do go and read regularly. But that's so I get, my, what the narrative is that's being sold to us. That's what I use those sources for. And then I have a whole bunch of other sources. So the Duran is fantastic. So Alex at the Duran, I listen to them a lot. There's a bunch of good podcasts. I judge can't say his name, Neapolitano I'll probably mispronounce that, in the US. He has some great interviews, some great regulars on. Who else? Neutrality Studies, Dialogue Works. I listen to Jeffrey Sachs.
Jeffrey Sachs is very good.
Yeah, and I listen to John Mearsheimer. I agree with a lot of his stuff, but I think he's got this anti-China thing in his head, which I don't agree with. But he still I think in a lot of things he's perceptive. There's guys like Cyrus Jansen, who was in China and is now back in the US, but he's very good in China. Jerry Gray, who's in China, good on China. Andy Boren, there's a whole bunch of people.
They're sort of Twitter type people, are they? Or are they
most
blog
of them
writers?
Twitter, they've got YouTube. They're not hard to find. But yeah, Twitter, you'll find them, and then on YouTube. Who else? Moon of Alabama is a good blog. He sort of covers sort of one issue per day, but he goes into a great deal of depth and finds lots of information, which because he spends so much time just focusing on an issue, he finds information and packages that up in a way that cuts through the narrative of whatever the issue of the day is.
So how many hours a week are you spending just reading and looking at stuff, do you reckon?
Too much. I'd say I get up fairly early, so I do a lot of my reading in the morning. But I'd probably spend 1 to 2 hours a day on average, I'd say. Sometimes I give myself a break. Sometimes I'll do more. But, that's probably about it. But I tend to focus on issues that I think are important, and also something that I know something about. What you got to start somewhere. But I noticed when I was in defence that the reporting on defence of issues with defence and my knowledge of defence didn't align. So you can see that. Well, yeah, they're sensationalising that. Not saying defence is perfect by any means, but you can just tell that you'd have an understanding of an issue, then you see how it's reported in the media, and know that there was quite a difference.
Yep.
And I think that's the same with any of the I guess the big ones I've been focusing on, Russia and Ukraine war, and also China. And I think I have a reasonable understanding of the issues and the complexities and the history and that of those sort of events. And I know how many porcupines we're getting told, such as it was unprovoked. How many times you've heard that about the Russia's operations in Ukraine. So I have an understanding of those, and then you think, well, if I know how big the porcupines are being told on those issues are, if we go and apply them to every other sort of story, I start with a great deal of skepticism as to whatever the narrative is about an issue. And I guess fool me once, shame
on you. Fool me twice. Shame on me. Yeah.
I think I'm going through it. I guess what triggered that for me was in 2018 the Duma chemical weapons incident, or alleged chemical weapons assault. Do you remember that?
Was this like they found a missile
Yes.
lying in a building and
On a bed,
it was obviously planted there or something like that? It was a whole bits of evidence that strongly indicated that this was a complete setup.
That's right. And then you had the OPCW. So after this happened, of course, the British, French, and US fired missiles at Syria before the OPCW, so the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, had a chance to get their investigators in there. So they'd already reacted. And then you have Robert Fisk, the late Robert Fisk, the British journalist, was in there and could find no evidence of there being a chemical weapons attack. And then, the OPCW inspectors go in there and they write their reports and they suggest that, it was a staged incident. And then you have the OPCW rewriting the report and the whistleblowers coming out. And that's Aaron Matta. He's another good journalist worth following who's gone through this in forensic detail. And you can just tell that they've manipulated the report to suit their outcome, being that the Syrian government was responsible, when it looks like the white helmets and the other moderate rebels or terrorists, we call them moderate rebels, but a normal person might call them a terrorist, were responsible for that attack. So I guess that wasn't the tipping point per se. The tipping point for me was that even though there was credible witnesses, as in the investigators from the OPCW, who even went to the United Nations Security Council and presented there on their findings, even though there was all this reliable evidence, whether it's 100% correct or not is not the point, but it just got ignored. So in our media, it was ignored. And that was a tipping point for me, because I realised, hang on, this is not a lack of knowledge that I know because I wrote a complaint to the ABC to which I didn't reply. It wasn't a lack of knowledge. It was a deliberate decision not to cover an incident because by covering it, it would expose the wrongdoing of, the United States and Britain, our allies in AUKUS. And I guess that was a tipping point for me, realising, we're deliberately being manipulated to think certain things. Up until that point, I mean, I even wrote an article for ASPI once and sent it in after the Novichok poisoning, thinking they were, interested in honest and after Michael Shoebridge wrote an article which was just so full of so many untruths. And the editor said, I'm not going to publish, but we've noted the issues and I've spoken to the author about it. But, they obviously didn't publish it. This is when I thought they were an honest sort of organisation.
Yes.
So this is all about 2017, 18, like when I just finally came to the conclusion, realised, hang on, this isn't about a lack of information or ignorance. This is a deliberate, this is deliberate to manage the narrative, to keep us thinking, as in the population thinking a certain way, so that our government and the government of our allies can get away with doing some horrendous things.
Yep. Unfortunately, I think it takes a disaster we're soft. We've had it very good for a very long time, and it's easy just to not worry about these things and just continue on with our upper middle class Western lifestyles. And it really just takes sometimes a disaster to get people to stop and to question some of these things. I don't see it happening without that to some extent. I think there'll only be significant change when there's a result of significant pain, unfortunately.
And I tend to agree with you. And this is like the people who are doing us no favours as far as where they're positioning Australia. They're working 365 days of the year to further their cause. And, the little plebs like me and you are trying to, change the conversation or steer us in a slightly different direction where, we're doing this in our 1 or 2 hours a day when we've got time and we're disorganised and that. And I guess I can see at some point there's going to be a crisis. What that looks like, I can't make predictions because it could come in many different ways, shapes or forms. But I guess that's why I think is we need to have an alternate vision for how this country can run. Who we're aligned with, why we're aligned with people, how we deal with our international relations. I think we should follow the foreign policy of Vietnam. No foreign military forces on their soil, no alliances, and no getting up on one country against another. Like, what is wrong with that as a basis of a foreign policy, particularly for a country like Australia, which is our geography means we're in an awfully good situation. So. I guess that's where I'm thinking is what we need to get organised. So when a crisis does happen, there is an alternative, and a thought through alternative that can be sold to the people. Because I like to think we're in a democracy, and what the people think actually matters still. I think that's where we need to get to. I think one thing we do have on our side though is that the Chinese and the Russians, they're playing the long game. They can see where things are heading. And to be honest, I think if we can survive the next 2 or 3 years without a conflict between China and Australia, or China and the US involving Australia, I think it'll be such overwhelming evidence and obvious to everyone that the US is a mere shell of itself and it can't take down China without destroying itself. And there's hopefully enough rational people in the United States in the positions of power to see that as well, that we might just get to the point where we can say, righto, we tried to defeat you, we lost. We now realise that we need to actually work with you and come up with a modus vivendi as to how we can, get along. We don't have to like each other, but get along. I think at that point we might be all right. But I think the next 2 to 3 years could be quite perilous. You can see, how much belligerence there is towards Russia and towards China and how restrained their responses are. It's because they're playing the long game and they can see the writing on the wall. And the rest of the world can too, hence why so many countries are joining BRICS lining up to join BRICS and who aren't being badgered and, following, the US says you shall put sanctions on Russia, and they're saying, hang on, no, we're not, because we're going to buy wheat or oil or something like that from Russia. Why are we going to disadvantage ourselves? So I think we're really in that sort of phase change, and it could go a couple of ways. And one way is conflict, war, and up to and including nuclear war. I'd suggest that's the path we want to avoid, versus a world where we said, right, it's best to get along rather than fight to the death. And that's what I'd like to see.
Traditionally, the US exercised economic power when it wanted to sort of change countries. So they'd get the IMF and the World Bank involved, make loans that the countries couldn't pay back, and introduce sort of neoliberal policies where they had to basically sell off their public infrastructure and allow foreign multinationals to come in and buy that infrastructure, and at the same time remove all tariffs. And that crippled a lot of small countries and kept them subservient as basically, agricultural banana republics. And if that didn't work and there was a recalcitrant sort of dictator or recalcitrant a democratic leader, they would then go for sanctions, and the resulting economic woe would be enough that they could perhaps foment a false opposition and have a sort of organise a colour revolution aided by the CIA. And if that didn't work, then they would assassinate the leader. And if that didn't work, they'd invade. And, China is too big and too strong for any of that to work. They refused IMF World Bank intervention, and they refused to allow US multinationals to come in and buy up. And that's what's, part of the problem is American companies look at China and think how much money they could make if they could get in there, as they normally do on the terms they normally get. So the other thing is that, here's a thought experiment for you, Cameron, is my prediction is that it will be the collapse of the US dollar that triggers the obvious collapse of the US empire. And this is really accelerating along now with the BRICS group agreeing to do all sorts of deals in their local currencies. And the US dollar for so many decades was basically supported by Saudi Arabia, where the US said, here's the deal, you can keep selling oil around the world, but every barrel that you sell has to be in US dollars. And that provided a backing for the US dollar that it was always equivalent to several, whatever number of barrels of oil. So that power of the US dollar as the world's default currency is disappearing very rapidly. And when that finishes, people don't need US dollars because they don't buy stuff from the US. And when the dollar collapses to where it should be, things will get really expensive in America, and that will really be the sort of economic chaos. And here's the thought experiment part, Cameron. The union breaks up. The people in America, they've got, in the flyover states, they're a different group to the people in the east and the west and sort of urban populations. They don't have a lot in common, these people. The real issue down the track will be, how does the world deal with the breakup of the USA as it just collapses into ruins, while it still has all of these nuclear weapons and this military hardware? That's going to be the question: is how to manage that without those guys committing some sort of crazy suicide with the rest of the planet as they break up. I think that's where the danger is, as a thought experiment.
Yeah, it's interesting you raise that, because in 2018, I submitted a paper to the Australian Defence Force Journal, basically on the demise of the US dollar and the impacts that would have. Funnily enough, it didn't get published, so. Yeah, well, I'd go back to once the world doesn't need US dollars, obviously the US model is it's already on borrowed time. And so I think the scenario layer is pretty a likely outcome.
Possible.
Plausible. Outcome. Well, yeah. And I think this is why, go back to my comment on Russia and China and the rest, the rest of the major powers. I think they can see this happening. And they could, but they're not doing anything quickly. So I think they're taking their time. It's almost boring. Like, you look what Russia's doing in Ukraine. Like, there's it's just grinding them down. Is boring in a ways. And another day we'll send another X number of glide bombs and thousands of shells and kill X number of Ukrainians, and we'll repeat that day after day after day. And I think it's the same if we look at the the geoeconomics and that. We take our time, we talk, we negotiate, we come up with mutually beneficial deals, and it might take years, but we get to that point and then we have it, and it's just sort of slowly by slowly. So I think that's part of their strategy to manage the decline of the US, is not to just, we've got the balloon, the big bubble that's the US debt and popping it, which would be catastrophic for a lot of countries, not all countries, but a lot of countries. I think they're managing the decline of the United States, and I guess in a lot of ways we probably should be thankful that they are, because it could be quite traumatic.
Yeah, and they must be just looking at us, shaking their heads, and going, "You idiots, you idiots."
Well, I have a friend, Warwick Powell, who we're friends, and we go back and forth on Twitter and share each other's stuff and that. But he travels to China quite a lot, and basically my understanding is that the Chinese see us as being, we're in a situation where we're doing all that can be expected because of where we're located within the alliance and our history and stuff like that. So I guess the Chinese are being a little bit forgiving of us because they know our circumstances. So I guess this is another way of looking at, the managed decline of a system, because at some point, I think, as things break up, and Australia will be sitting here like a shag and a rock saying, maybe it's a good idea that we make good with the Chinese and ASEAN and BRICS doesn't sound like that bad of an idea. We could probably benefit from that rather than fighting it. And yeah, so maybe, I don't know, 10 years, 20 years or something like that in the future, we could see ourselves in very different circumstances, which I think would be great.
Yeah. Well, we certainly live in interesting times. It's not every day that the most powerful empire the world has ever seen really peaks and declines in front of our very eyes, which is kind of what's happened here. So...
And I was too young really to really grasp what the collapse of the Soviet Union was all about. So in some ways, it's actually a privilege to be able to live through such a momentous time. But it's also a dangerous time. So,
well, this seems like a reasonable place to finish off, Cameron, as we've done what we threatened to do, which was agree with each other for 60 minutes. But that's okay, because there's plenty of people out there to disagree with. So it's just nice to have an agreeable chat. So, so it's been fun, Cameron. So basically, keep up the good work with your articles, with the John Menady blog, and your tweeting and your other stuff. And thanks for what you're doing. Keep up the good work is all I could say.
No worries. Thanks, Trevor, and thanks for the opportunity to have a chat, because this is really important stuff.
Yep, no worries. All right, dear listener, next week I will be back for sure with Scott and Joe on the panel talking about all sorts of things. So we'll talk to you then.